To discover who still carried humanity in their eyes, a millionaire disguised himself as a beggar. In the most forgotten shelter of the city, he was seen, welcomed, and fed by a girl who had nothing. Her gesture of sharing the little she had with someone who seemed to have even less changed everything. If you were touched by this beautiful story of resilience and love, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing. The Seattle skyline gleamed like a diamond necklace against the slate-gray winter sky. From the top floor of the Mitchell Tower, Ethan Mitchell surveyed his kingdom with a glass of 30-year-old scotch in hand. 52 floors below, people moved like ants, scurrying between luxury boutiques and artisanal coffee shops, oblivious to the man who could buy and sell their lives with a phone call. "Mr. Mitchell, the board is waiting." His assistant Melanie stood at the doorway, tablet in hand, her voice carefully neutral. Ethan nodded without turning. At 45, he had built Envision Tech from a startup in his garage to a multi-billion-dollar tech empire. His face regularly appeared in business magazines, always with the same caption, "America's most innovative CEO." What those magazines failed to capture was the growing emptiness behind his eyes. "Tell them I'll be there in 5, he said, finishing his drink. The boardroom fell silent as he entered. 12 faces turned toward him, each wearing a carefully composed expression of respect tinged with fear. These were people paid handsomely to agree with him. The meeting proceeded as they always did. Reports, projections, strategies. Words that once excited him now blurred together in a monotonous stream. "And finally the charity gala next month," said Daniel Cooper, his COO and oldest friend. "The PR team needs your approval on the guest list and the donation amount." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Another $5 million to children's hospitals. Another check to write while we sip champagne and pat ourselves on the back." The room fell uncomfortably silent. Daniel cleared his throat. "It's for a good cause, Ethan. And the press coverage, Ethan repeated, a bitter smile forming. "Of course. That's what matters, isn't it? Not whether we're actually making a difference." Later, in Daniel's office, his friend confronted him. "What was that about?" "You've been acting strange for months." Ethan stared out the window at the rain beginning to fall. Seattle winters were notoriously dreary, but this year seemed particularly bleak. "Do you ever wonder if any of this means anything, Danny? The money, the power, the endless charity events, where we throw cash at problems without understanding them." Daniel sighed. "Is this about Rebecca again?" "It's been a year since the divorce. You need to move on." "It's not about Rebecca, though in some ways perhaps it was." His ex-wife had claimed he was incapable of genuine human connection. "Too much head, not enough heart," she'd said during their last fight. The words had lodged somewhere deep inside him, a splinter he couldn't remove. That evening, Ethan's driver, Morris, navigated through downtown Seattle's rain-slicked streets. Through the tinted windows, Ethan watched people hurrying home, collars turned up against the December chill. His eye caught on a homeless man huddled in a doorway, ignored by every passerby. "Morris, stop the car." The driver looked back in surprise. "Sir, I said stop the car." Against the driver's protests, Ethan stepped out into the rain, approaching the man in the doorway. Up close, the smell was overpowering, a mixture of unwashed body, alcohol, and desperation. "Here," Ethan said, pulling out his wallet and extracting several $100 bills. He held them out, but the man just stared at them. Then at Ethan's Italian leather shoes, his tailored suit now getting soaked in the downpour. "I don't want your guilt money," the man said finally, his voice surprisingly clear. "You think throwing cash at me makes you a good person? Go back to your mansion, rich boy." Ethan stood frozen, the money still extended. Rain dripped from his hair into his eyes. In all his years of charitable giving, he'd never actually handed money directly to someone in need. He'd never looked into the eyes of the people his foundation supposedly helped. "I just want to help," he said, aware of how hollow it sounded. The man laughed, a harsh sound. "You want to help? Try understanding first. You have no idea what this life is like. None." Back in his penthouse, Ethan couldn't shake the encounter. The man's words echoed in his mind as he poured another drink. On his coffee table sat the latest issue of Seattle Business Monthly, with his face on the cover. Ethan Mitchell, the man who has everything. He tossed it aside with a bitter laugh. His phone rang. Daniel again. He ignored it, moving instead to his floor-to-ceiling windows. Below, the city lights blurred in the rain. Somewhere down there, people were struggling just to survive another night. People like the man in the doorway, who had seen right through his superficial attempt at charity. Maybe Rebecca was right. Maybe he had lost the ability to connect with real people. Years of boardrooms and balance sheets of yes-men and sycophants, had they stripped away something essential? When was the last time anyone had been truly honest with him? An idea began to form, so absurd that he almost dismissed it immediately. But once planted, it grew, taking root in his mind until he could think of nothing else. "Try understanding first," the homeless man had said. The next morning, he called Daniel to his office. "I'm taking a leave of absence," he announced without preamble. "Personal reasons. I need you to handle things for a few weeks." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. "A leave of absence now?" "Ethan, we have the product launch in January, the quarterly reports, the—" "You can handle it." Ethan's tone left no room for argument. "I trust you." "Is this some kind of midlife crisis? Should I be worried about you?" Ethan almost smiled. "Maybe you should be. But I'll be fine. I just need perspective." After Daniel left, bewildered but acquiescent, Ethan made one more call to Morris, instructing him to pick up some very specific items from very non-specific stores. The kind of stores Ethan Mitchell would never patronize. 3 days later, no one would have recognized the billionaire CEO of Envision Tech. His designer suits had been replaced with worn jeans and a stained parka from a thrift store. His normally clean-shaven face now sported a week's growth of beard, carefully left untrimmed. He'd rubbed dirt into his hands and under his fingernails, scuffed his cheap boots, and applied a subtle sheen of oil to his hair. The final touch was a backpack containing only the essentials: a worn blanket, a water bottle, a few granola bars, and $50 in small bills. No credit cards, no ID, no smartphone. Nothing that would reveal his true identity. Morris was the only one who knew, sworn to secrecy under penalty of termination. He dropped Ethan off 3 miles from downtown, in a nondescript neighborhood where no one would question a seemingly homeless man walking toward the city center. "Sir, are you absolutely certain about this?" Morris asked one final time, concern etched across his weathered face. "This could be dangerous. At least let me follow you, keep watch." "That defeats the purpose, Morris. I need to do this. I need to understand." As the luxury car pulled away, Ethan Mitchell, or Ed, as he'd decided to call himself during this experiment, took his first steps into a world he'd only ever observed from behind tinted windows. The December air bit through his inadequate clothing, the first real discomfort he'd felt in years. It was oddly invigorating. By nightfall, the novelty had worn off. The temperature had dropped further, and a light drizzle had begun to fall. His stomach growled, unaccustomed to hunger. He'd walked for hours, blending into the urban landscape, invisible in the way that only the homeless could be. People's eyes slid past him as if he were a piece of uncomfortable furniture, something to be acknowledged, but not engaged with. He'd passed several shelters, but hadn't yet worked up the courage to enter. What if they asked questions he couldn't answer? What if they recognized him despite the disguise? The experiment would be over before it began. But as the rain intensified and the temperature continued to drop, Ed, realized he had no choice. He'd heard about the Harbor Light Shelter on Pike Street. It was one of the larger facilities, less likely to scrutinize newcomers too carefully. With every step toward the shelter, the reality of his situation became clearer. He wasn't just playing a role. He was experiencing, in some small way, the vulnerability that came with having nowhere to go. For the first time in decades, Ethan Mitchell was at the mercy of others. The Harbor Light Shelter was a converted warehouse, its brick exterior weathered by decades of Seattle rain. A small sign above the entrance offered the only indication of its purpose. Inside, the harsh fluorescent lighting illuminated a large room filled with folding tables and chairs. The smell of institutional food, bland but warm, filled the air, mingling with the unmistakable odor of too many bodies in too small a space. Ed joined the line of people waiting to check in, his heart pounding. This was it. There was no turning back now. "Name?" asked the tired-looking woman at the intake desk, not bothering to look up from her clipboard. "Ed," he replied, his voice intentionally rough. "Ed Marshall. Any ID, Ed?" The woman at the intake desk finally looked up, her eyes tired but not unkind. Lost it, Ed mumbled, the lie sticking in his throat. Got jumped last week. She nodded, unsurprised. Happens all the time. How long you been on the streets? Couple months, he replied, sticking to the backstory he'd created. Recently homeless, down on his luck, looking for work. Simple enough to remember, vague enough to avoid detailed questions. Well, we're pretty full tonight, but we'll find you a spot. Rules are simple. No drugs, no alcohol, no fighting. Breakfast at 6, everyone out by 7. You can leave your backpack in the locker, but we're not responsible for stolen items. Ed nodded, clutching his backpack a little tighter. Not that it contained anything valuable, but the instinct to protect what little you had seemed to come naturally in this environment. Sarah will show you around, the woman said, gesturing to a younger staff member who approached with a clipboard of her own. Sarah Reynolds had the look of someone who'd seen too much but hadn't yet lost her capacity for compassion. Early 30s, brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, eyes that assessed without judging. First time at Harbour Light? She asked as she led him through the main room. First time at any shelter, Ed admitted. Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. Where were you staying before? My car, he improvised. Until it got repossessed. She nodded, seemingly satisfied. Well, you'll be safe here. It's not the Ritz, but it's warm and dry. She pointed out the bathrooms, the dining area, the small medical clinic that operated 2 nights a week. Dinner's already started. Get in line before it's all gone. The food was exactly what he expected. Watery stew, bread that was just shy of stale, and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing all day. Yet Ed found himself ravenously hungry, the simple meal more satisfying than any Michelin-starred restaurant he'd frequented in recent memory. He sat alone, observing the dynamics around him. There were the regulars, clearly familiar with the shelter and its routines. The newly homeless, like himself, still shell-shocked and awkward. The mentally ill, talking to themselves or staring into space. And the workers, a mixture of burned-out professionals and idealistic volunteers. In the corner, a small group of children played with worn toys under the watchful eye of a woman he assumed was a social worker. Among them, a little girl with honey-blonde hair caught his attention. Unlike the others, she wasn't playing. Instead, she was helping a younger child with his food, making sure he ate before taking any for herself. That's Lily, said a voice beside him. Sarah had appeared with a clipboard, doing some kind of count. She's something special, that one. She lives here? Ed couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. Sarah's expression softened. Her and her grandmother. Been with us about 6 months now. Margaret, that's the grandmother, had a stroke, lost her job, then their apartment. Lily's parents aren't in the picture. She seems mature for her age. Poverty ages you, Sarah replied simply. But Lily's kept her heart. That's the miracle. As if sensing their conversation, the girl Lily looked up, her eyes meeting Ed's across the room. She didn't smile, but there was a curiosity in her gaze, an assessment that seemed far older than her 7 or 8 years. After dinner came the sleeping arrangements. The shelter was divided into sections, men's, women's, and a small family area. Ed was assigned a bottom bunk in a row of identical metal frames, each with a thin mattress and threadbare blanket. You're lucky, said his neighbor, her grizzled man who introduced himself as Pete. Last week we had people sleeping on the floor. Winter's the worst time. Everyone wants in from the cold. Ed lay awake long after lights out, listening to the symphony of snores, coughs, and occasional sobs that filled the darkened room. The mattress springs dug into his back, the pillow smelled of industrial detergent, and the blanket barely kept the chill at bay. Yet all he could think about was the little girl, Lily, and the way she'd cared for the younger child. In his world, his real world, such selflessness was rare. People gave to get something in return. Recognition, tax benefits, business connections. When was the last time he'd done something kind, with no expectation of reward? He couldn't remember. Morning came too soon, announced by harsh fluorescent lights and a staff member's voice calling out the wake-up time. Ed joined the shuffling line for the bathroom, then for breakfast, cold cereal, toast, more of the terrible coffee. As promised, by 7 o'clock, everyone was being ushered out into the cold morning. Where do they all go? Ed asked Sarah, who was supervising the exit. Libraries, day centers, fast food restaurants, anywhere warm where they can sit for a while without being kicked out, she explained. Some look for work, some panhandle, some just walk to keep warm until we open again at 4. And the children? Like Lily? There's a day program for homeless kids 3 blocks over. School-age ones go to public school. We have a van that takes them. Outside, Seattle was waking up. Office workers in expensive coats hurried past, clutching coffee cups from artisanal cafes, eyes fixed on smartphones or the middle distance, anywhere but on the people emerging from the shelter. The invisibility that had unnerved Ed the previous day now seemed like a protective cloak. He was no longer Ethan Mitchell, billionaire. He was Ed Marshall, nobody. He spent the day as the others did, walking when the cold became too much to bear while sitting still, resting in public libraries and the downtown mall food court, always moving before security could ask him to leave. He used a few dollars from his emergency fund to buy coffee, nursing the cup for hours just to stay in the warmth. By late afternoon, his feet ached, his back hurt, and the chill had settled into his bones in a way that made him doubt he'd ever feel truly warm again. The simple physical discomforts were a revelation. How had he never realized the luxury of being able to simply exist in a space without being asked to justify your presence? When the shelter reopened at 4, Ed was among the first in line. Inside, he scanned the room for Lily but didn't see her. Instead, he found himself helping to set up tables for dinner, falling into conversation with Pete and a few other regulars. "First day out there, huh?" said Pete, noting Ed's exhaustion. "You'll get used to it." "Sort of. Does it get easier?" Ed asked. Pete's laugh was without humor. "Nothing about this life gets easier, friend. You just get better at surviving it." As dinner time approached, the families began to arrive, among them Lily and an older woman who moved slowly with the aid of a cane. Margaret, the grandmother, Ed presumed. They sat at a table near the serving line, Lily helping her grandmother get settled, before taking her place in line with a tray for each of them. Ed watched as the servers dished out the evening meal, macaroni and cheese tonight, with a side of canned green beans and more of the ever-present stale bread. When it was Lily's turn, the server hesitated, looking into the near-empty pan of pasta. "Sorry, sweetie, we're running low. Just half portions until we see if there's enough for everyone." Lily nodded without complaint, accepting the meager serving and returning to her grandmother. Ted noticed how she gave the larger portion to the older woman, keeping the smaller one for herself. Even then, she ate slowly, methodically, making the food last. When Ed's turn came, the pasta was gone entirely. Only green beans and bread remained. "Tomorrow we'll have more," the server promised apologetically. "End of the month is always tight." Ed nodded, taking his tray to an empty spot not far from Lily and her grandmother. He poked at the beans without enthusiasm, his mind on the comfortable restaurants where he'd often left food uneaten simply because he was too full, or it wasn't prepared exactly to his liking. A movement caught his eye. Lily had stood up and was walking toward him, carrying half of her already small portion of macaroni and cheese. Without a word, she placed it on his tray, then turned to go back to her grandmother. "Wait," Ed said, startled. "I can't take your food." Lily turned back, her expression serious. "You got nothing but beans. That's not a real dinner." Her voice was soft but matter-of-fact. "I already ate some. Grandma and I are okay." Before he could protest further, she returned to her table, leaving Ed staring at the small mound of pasta as if it were gold. Across the room, he noticed Sarah watching the exchange, her expression unreadable. That night, as he lay once again on the uncomfortable shelter bunk, Ed couldn't get the moment out of his mind. A child with next to nothing had given him half of what little she had, without hesitation, without fanfare. The simple act of kindness had left him more shaken than any business crisis or personal setback. In the morning, he found Sarah before leaving the shelter. "The little girl, Lily, is there anything I can do for her?" "And her grandmother?" Sarah studied him, suspicious. "Why the interest?" Ed hesitated, unsure how to explain. "She shared her food with me last night. I want to return the kindness." "Unless you've got a job and an apartment to offer them, there's not much any of us can do," Sarah replied, her tone softening. "But Lily's birthday is next week. She'll be 8. If you wanted to do something small." 8, Ed repeated, the number hitting him like a physical blow. At 8, he'd been living in his family's mansion with private tutors and a pool and every toy imaginable. The contrast was unbearable. "I'll think of something," he promised. For the next 3 days, Ed fell into the rhythm of shelter life. Wake before dawn, venture into the cold, search for warmth during daylight hours, return at 4, eat whatever was offered, sleep on the uncomfortable bunk. The monotony was broken only by his growing observations of Lily and her grandmother. Margaret Anderson, he learned, had been a school librarian before her stroke. Now partially paralyzed on her left side, she struggled with the most basic tasks, relying heavily on her granddaughter's assistance. Despite their circumstances, she maintained a quiet dignity. Each morning, she combed Lily's hair into neat braids before they left the shelter, and each evening, she helped the girl with homework sent from the school Lily still managed to attend. "School's important," Lily told Ed matter-of-factly when he found himself sitting near them at dinner on the 3rd night. "I'm going to be a doctor someday, or maybe an astronaut. I haven't decided." "Both excellent choices," Ed replied, smiling at her seriousness. "Lily has always reached for the stars," Margaret said, her speech slightly slurred from the stroke. "Just like her mother did." A shadow passed over Lily's face at the mention of her mother, and she quickly changed the subject, asking Ed about his favorite space fact. He found himself drawn into a surprisingly sophisticated conversation about the solar system, with this child who seemed to absorb knowledge like a sponge despite her circumstances. Later, Sarah filled in some of the blanks as Ed helped clean up after dinner, a task he'd volunteered for to feel useful and to learn more about the shelter's operations. "Lily's mom was a bright one too," she said. "Full scholarship to UW studying biochemistry. Then she met Tyler, that's Lily's dad, and things went downhill. Drugs, mostly. They lost custody of Lily when she was 4. Margaret's raised her ever since. And now they're here," Ed said, the injustice of it burning in his chest. Sarah nodded. "Margaret's medical bills wiped out her savings, and her pension barely covers medications. They were making it work in a tiny apartment until the stroke. After that," she shrugged, the gesture conveying the swiftness with which stability could collapse. On the 4th day of his experiment, as Ed still thought of it, though it was becoming something far more profound, he made a decision. Lily's birthday was approaching, and he wanted to do something special. Not as Ethan Mitchell, billionaire, but as Ed Marshall, fellow shelter resident. He ventured further from the shelter than he had before, walking to a discount store in a working-class neighborhood. There, he spent a carefully calculated amount of his emergency fund, enough to buy a gift, but not so much that it would seem suspicious coming from a homeless man. His selection was thoughtful. A solar system model kit with planets that glowed in the dark, a book about women astronauts, and a small birthday card. The total came to just under $20, leaving him with enough for a chocolate cupcake from the bakery section. The cashier eyed him suspiciously as he counted out the wrinkled bills, her gaze taking in his unwashed appearance and worn clothes. Ed felt the sting of judgment, the unspoken questions about how someone like him could afford even this small indulgence. Another new experience to add to his growing list, the assumption of unworthiness that came with poverty. Back at the shelter that evening, he approached Sarah with his purchases carefully concealed in a plastic bag. "For Lily's birthday," he explained. Would it be appropriate to give these to her? Or should they be from the shelter?" Sarah's expression softened. "You can give them to her yourself. Her birthday's tomorrow. We always do a little something for the kids here, cupcakes after dinner. You can add yours then." The next day passed with excruciating slowness. Ed found himself unusually anxious, concerned that his gifts might be inappropriate or insufficient. Would Lily prefer something else? Would Margaret be uncomfortable with a relative stranger giving her granddaughter presents? These worries, so mundane in the context of his former life, where he regularly made million-dollar decisions without a second thought, consumed him entirely. When evening finally arrived, the shelter dining room had been decorated with a few crepe paper streamers and a hand-lettered happy birthday sign. After the regular dinner service, Sarah brought out a tray of cupcakes, simple supermarket varieties with colorful frosting, and led everyone in singing to an embarrassed but pleased-looking Lily. "We have a few special things for the birthday girl," Sarah announced once the singing ended. "From all of us at Harbor Light." She presented Lily with a new backpack filled with school supplies, explaining to the room that it had been donated by a local business. There was also a winter coat, that looked new but had clearly been chosen from donation bins, and a pair of pink sneakers that made Lily's eyes light up. "And it looks like someone else has something for you," Sarah added, nodding toward Ed. Heart hammering inexplicably, Ed stepped forward with his plastic bag. "Happy birthday, Lily," he said, suddenly feeling foolish. What had seemed like a good idea now felt presumptuous. Who was he to intrude on this moment? But Lily's reaction dispelled his doubts. Her eyes widened as she pulled out the solar system kit, her fingers tracing the planets depicted on the box. "This is the one I saw in a magazine at school," she exclaimed. "How did you know?" Ed hadn't known, of course. The coincidence made the moment feel somehow fated. "Lucky guess," he managed. "You seem like a space kind of kid." When she discovered the book beneath the kit, Lily actually gasped. "Women astronauts! Look, Grandma, there's Mae Jemison and Sally Ride." Margaret met Ed's eyes over her granddaughter's head, a question in her gaze. He could read her thoughts. Why would this stranger, himself clearly in need, spend money on her granddaughter? Ed had no answer, at least none he could articulate. He only knew that Lily's joy in this moment was worth more than all the corporate acquisitions and stock price increases that had marked his successful life. The cupcake, presented last, was received with equal enthusiasm. Lily insisted on splitting it 3 ways, a third for herself, a third for her grandmother, and a third for Ed. The echo of her earlier generosity with the macaroni and cheese wasn't lost on him. "Thank you," she said solemnly, after everyone had enjoyed their portion of cupcake. "This is my best birthday ever." The sincerity in her voice nearly undid him. That this could be her best birthday ever, a few paper streamers, donated necessities, and his modest gifts in a homeless shelter, was both heartbreaking and humbling. Later, as the dining area was being cleared and residents prepared for lights out, Margaret approached him. She moved slowly, leaning heavily on her cane. Determination in every step. "I need to ask," she said without preamble, her voice low enough that Lily, happily showing her new solar system kit to another child, couldn't hear. "Why are you doing this? Taking an interest in my granddaughter?" The question, though expected, still caught Ed off guard. In it he heard the protective concern of a guardian who had seen too much of the world's darker side. "She helped me," he said simply, "when I had nothing but green beans on my plate. She didn't have to do that." Margaret studied him, her gaze surprisingly shrewd despite her physical frailty. "Lily has always been that way. Even when we lost everything, her first concern was for others. Sometimes I think—" She paused, emotion briefly overtaking her. "Sometimes I think she's the one taking care of me, not the other way around." "She's an extraordinary child," Ed agreed. "Yes," Margaret's voice strengthened. "And I won't have her hurt. We may be down on our luck, Mr. Marshall, but we still have our dignity. If you have ulterior motives—" "I don't," Ed interrupted, shocked at the implication. "I swear to you, He struggled to find words that wouldn't reveal too much. "I've been re-evaluating a lot of things lately. Lily's kindness came at a moment when I needed reminding that there's still good in the world." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because Margaret's posture relaxed slightly. "Well, thank you for the gifts. They were thoughtful." She glanced at Lily, who was demonstrating to another child how the planets would orbit once the model was assembled. She hasn't been this excited in a long time. That night, Ed lay awake on his bunk, listening to the now familiar sounds of the shelter at night. The conversation with Margaret had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Her suspicion was natural, even appropriate. A stranger showing interest in a child would raise alarms in any context, let alone the vulnerable environment of a shelter. But it was her fierce protection of Lily's dignity that struck him most deeply. We may be down on our luck, but we still have our dignity. How often had he and his wealthy peers discussed the homeless as a monolithic problem to be solved, rather than as individuals with their own stories, pride, and humanity? His experiment had begun as a way to understand what the homeless man in the doorway had meant about trying to understand before helping. Now, 5 days in, Ed was beginning to realize how superficial his initial concept had been. He'd thought a few nights in a shelter would give him insight, that he could then return to his life and implement more effective charitable programs based on his experience. The reality was both simpler and infinitely more complex. Every person here had a story, Margaret and Lily's circumstances could happen to anyone. Illness, job loss, a few missed rent payments. The line between stability and homelessness was thinner than most comfortable people ever acknowledged. And kindness, true kindness, not the tax-deductible kind practiced at charity galas, could come from those with the least to give. Lily, with her shared macaroni and cheese and her three-way split cupcake, had demonstrated more genuine humanity than many of the millionaires and billionaires Ed counted among his acquaintances. As he drifted toward sleep, Ed realized his experiment had evolved into something else entirely. He wasn't just observing anymore. He was involved. And the people he had come to study had instead begun to change him in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. On the morning of his 7th day at Harbor Light, Ed woke with a realization. He needed to check in with his real life. No matter how immersive this experience had become, he was still Ethan Mitchell, CEO of Envision Tech, and there were responsibilities he couldn't indefinitely abandon. After leaving the shelter at the mandatory 7 a.m. exit time, he made his way to a predetermined meeting spot where Morris would be waiting with a change of clothes, his phone and a ride back to civilization. The transition was jarring, stepping into the back of the luxury SUV, feeling the heated leather seats warm his perpetually cold body, seeing his own unrecognizable reflection in the tinted windows. 7 days, sir, Morris said, handing him a garment bag containing a fresh suit, as requested. Has it only been a week? Ed, no, Ethan now, mused, accepting the bag. It feels like longer. Morris drove him to his downtown apartment building, using the private entrance to avoid being seen in his current state. Once inside the penthouse, Ethan stood momentarily paralyzed, overwhelmed by the sheer space, the pristine surfaces, the absolute silence. After the constant noise and cramped quarters of the shelter, his home felt cavernous and oddly empty. He moved through his morning routine on autopilot, a long, scalding shower that washed away a week's worth of grime, the careful shaving of his beard, the application of expensive grooming products, the donning of a tailored suit that cost more than most shelter residents would see in months. Each action felt both familiar and strangely alien, as if he were putting on more than clothes. He was reinstating a persona. By the time he arrived at Envision Tech's headquarters, he looked every inch the billionaire CEO again. Only he knew that beneath the polished exterior lurked the memories of shelter bunks and watery stew, of Margaret's dignity and Lily's generosity. "Ethan!" Daniel exclaimed when he walked into his office. "Thank God, where have you been?" "I've been calling for days." "Personal retreat," Ethan replied smoothly. "No phones, no internet. Needed to clear my head." Daniel looked skeptical but didn't press. "Well, you picked a hell of a time for it. The Franklin merger is hitting some snags, and the board is getting nervous about the Q1 projections." The next few hours were a blur of meetings, calls, and decisions. Ethan moved through them with a strange sense of detachment, as if watching himself perform a role he knew well, but no longer fully inhabited. The problems that had once consumed his every waking thought now seemed trivial in comparison to Margaret's struggle to rebuild a life after her stroke, or Lily's determination to maintain her education despite homelessness. By mid-afternoon, his executive assistant, Melanie, was giving him concerned glances. "Are you feeling all right, Mr. Mitchell? You seem distracted." "I'm fine," he assured her, though it wasn't entirely true. He wasn't fine. He was fundamentally altered in ways he was still trying to process. At 5 o'clock, after the last meeting concluded, Daniel cornered him in his office. "Seriously, Ethan, what's going on with you? You've barely engaged all day. The board is already questioning your sudden absence, and now you're acting like you're sleepwalking through critical decisions." Ethan considered his oldest friend, wondering how much to reveal. "I've been doing some soul-searching, Danny, about what all this means." He gestured to the office, the view, the trappings of success that surrounded them. Daniel's expression softened slightly. "The divorce hit you hard, I know. But this company needs you. I need you. Whatever midlife crisis you're having, can it wait until after the Franklin merger?" "It's not a midlife crisis," Ethan replied, though he understood why it might appear that way. "It's clarity." After Daniel left, Ethan sat alone in his office, staring out at the Seattle skyline as darkness fell and lights began to twinkle on in buildings across the city. Somewhere out there, Harbour Light Shelter would be opening its doors for the evening, serving dinner to the hungry, providing beds to the tired. Lily would be showing her grandmother her homework, perhaps playing with the solar system model he'd given her, and he was here in his glass tower, more separated from that reality than mere physical distance could explain. A plan began to form in his mind, not fully shaped yet, but the contours becoming clear. He couldn't simply return to his old life, pretending the shelter had never happened. Nor could he abandon his responsibilities here, responsibilities to shareholders, employees and partners who depended on EnvisionTech's success. But perhaps there was a third option, a way to bridge these seemingly incompatible worlds. That evening, instead of returning to his penthouse, Ethan had Morris drive him to a nondescript hotel on the outskirts of downtown. There he changed back into Ed's clothes, deliberately mussing his hair and adding a layer of artificial grime to his hands and face, enough to maintain the disguise, but not so much that he couldn't wash it away in the morning. "Same routine tomorrow," he instructed Morris. "Pick me up 3 blocks from Harbour Light at 7:30 a.m. "Sir," Morris said hesitantly, "if I may ask, what exactly are you hoping to accomplish?" It was a fair question, one Ethan himself was still working through. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted, "but I know I'm not finished there yet." When he arrived at Harbour Light, Sarah raised an eyebrow at his day-long absence, but didn't question him. The residents were less reticent. "Thought you'd found something better, Ed," Pete commented as they lined up for dinner. "Day labor gig or something." "Had some things to take care of," Ed replied vaguely. Lily spotted him across the dining room and waved enthusiastically. "Ed, look!" She pointed to her neck, where she wore a small pendant shaped like Saturn, evidently crafted from parts of the solar system model kit. "I made it myself. Grandma helped with the string." "It's beautiful," he told her, genuinely impressed with her ingenuity. During dinner, Lily chatted about her day at school, a special science project she was working on, and her continued ambitions to become an astronaut doctor. Margaret watched their interaction with cautious acceptance, her initial suspicions somewhat eased, but not entirely dispelled. "We missed you today," Lily said suddenly, catching Ed off guard. "Didn't we, Grandma?" Margaret's smile was tight but not unfriendly. "Lily wondered where you'd gone." "I had to look for work," Ed improvised. "Did you find any?" Lily asked, her expression hopeful. The question pierced him. Here was this child, concerned about his welfare, hoping he'd found employment that might help him escape their shared circumstances. The layers of deception suddenly felt suffocating. "Not yet," he managed, "but I'm still looking." After dinner, as residents settled in for the night, Sarah pulled Ed aside. "Jim wants to see you," she said, referring to Jim Parker, the shelter's director. "His office is down the hall." Ed's pulse quickened. Had he been discovered? Had someone recognized him? Jim Parker's office was a cluttered space, barely larger than a closet, with filing cabinets lining the walls and a desk piled high with paperwork. The man himself was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair, and the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much of humanity's darker side. "Have a seat, Ed," Jim said, gesturing to the single chair across from his desk. "Sarah tells me you've been helping out around here, setting up tables, cleaning up after meals." Ed nodded, uncertain where this was leading. "We're short-staffed," Jim continued. "Always are. Funding gets cut every year, but the need just grows." He leaned forward, elbows on his desk. "I could use someone reliable for a few hours each day. Minimum wage. Under the table. Mostly cleaning. Maybe some intake processing once you learn the ropes. Interested?" The offer caught Ed completely off guard. "You'd hire me?" "But I'm—" He stopped, unsure how to continue without revealing too much. "Homeless?" Jim finished for him. "So was I 15 years ago. Sometimes the best help comes from people who understand the situation firsthand." The irony was almost too much to bear. Ethan, who had never known a day of true financial hardship in his life, being offered a job because he supposedly understood homelessness firsthand. "I appreciate the offer," he said carefully. "But my situation is complicated right now. I'm not sure I can commit." Jim studied him, eyes narrowing slightly. "There's something different about you, Ed. Can't quite put my finger on it. Most guys who come through here, you can read their story in their eyes. Yours is harder to figure out." Ed felt exposed, as if Jim could see through the grime and worn clothes to the billionaire beneath. "So I'm just trying to get back on my feet," he said, the half-truth sticking in his throat. "Aren't we all?" Jim replied, his tone suggesting he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, the offer stands. Think about it." For the next 3 days, Ethan lived his double life. Mornings as the CEO, afternoons and evenings as Ed the shelter resident. The constant switching between worlds was exhausting, not just physically but emotionally. Each persona felt increasingly like a partial truth, neither one capturing the whole of who he was becoming. At EnvisionTech, he moved through his duties with a new perspective, seeing opportunities for meaningful impact, where before he'd only seen profit margins. He initiated discussions about corporate social responsibility that left board members bewildered by his sudden passion for helping the homeless. "Since when do you care about affordable housing initiatives?" Daniel asked after one particularly heated meeting. "A month ago you were arguing that market forces should dictate property values." "People change," Ethan replied simply. At Harbour Light, he continued to connect with Lily and Margaret, learning more of their story with each interaction. Margaret had been widowed young, raised Lily's mother alone, then stepped in again when her daughter's addiction made her incapable of parenting. Now the stroke had reversed roles once more, making the grandmother dependent on the child in many ways. "She reads to me every night," Margaret confided, during a rare moment when Lily was occupied elsewhere. "My eyes get too tired and the words swim. So she reads anything she can get her hands on. Library books, newspapers, even the pamphlets they give us at the medical clinic. That child absorbs knowledge like a sponge." "She's remarkable," Ed agreed. "Her teachers must be impressed." Margaret's expression clouded. "They were, but it's getting harder. Moving schools twice in 6 months, missing days when I have medical appointments. And the other children," she trailed off, but Ed could fill in the blanks. "Children could be cruel about differences in socioeconomic status. She never complains," Margaret continued. "Not about the shelter, not about wearing the same clothes until they're falling apart, not about missing her friends or having nowhere to invite them. She just adapts, finds joy where she can, makes the best of what we have." The conversation stayed with Ed throughout the day and into his other life. During a budget meeting that afternoon, as executives argued over cutting costs in various departments, he found himself thinking about Lily reading to her grandmother by the dim light of the shelter common room, about her makeshift satin pendant, about her unflagging optimism in the face of circumstances that would crush most adults. Something had to change, not just for Lily and Margaret, but for all the people at Harbour Light, people with stories, with dignity, with potential that was being wasted, because society had written them off as a problem, rather than recognizing them as people. And Ethan Mitchell, with his resources and influence, was in a position to effect that change. The question was how to do it without exposing his deception, without making the residents of Harbour Light feel like subjects in an experiment, rather than the catalysts for genuine transformation that they had become. The balancing act between Ethan's two lives grew, increasingly precarious as days passed. In the corporate world, questions about his changed demeanor and new priorities mounted. At the shelter, his absences during the day were becoming harder to explain. Something had to give, and it happened on a rainy Tuesday morning in the most unexpected way. Ethan was in the middle of an executive committee meeting, presenting his vision for a new corporate foundation focused on homelessness and affordable housing, when his assistant interrupted with an urgent message. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm sorry, but there's a situation that requires your immediate attention," Melanie said, her professional composure barely masking her confusion. "There's a homeless child in reception asking to see you. She says her name is Lily." The room fell silent. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "Excuse me for a moment," he managed, following Melanie out while ignoring the bewildered looks from his executives. In the sleek, minimalist reception area of EnvisionTech's headquarters stood Lily Anderson, her worn coat and scuffed sneakers in stark contrast to the polished marble floors and designer furniture. She clutched her satin pendant with one hand, her backpack, the one given to her for her birthday, slung over her shoulder. "Lily?" Ethan approached cautiously, acutely aware of how different he looked from the Ed she knew. What are you doing here? How did you find me? Her eyes widened as she took in his appearance. The tailored suit, the clean-shaven face, the overall transformation from shelter resident to corporate titan. "It is you," she said, her voice small but certain. "I knew it. Sir, should I call security?" the receptionist asked, eyeing Lily with barely disguised discomfort. "No," Ethan said sharply. "This is a friend of mine." He knelt down to Lily's level. "Lily, how did you get here? Does your grandmother know where you are?" "Grandma's at her doctor appointment. The shelter has a volunteer who drives her." Lily's chin lifted slightly. "I followed you this morning. I saw you get into that big black car. The driver called you Mr. Mitchell. I asked a lady on the bus where the Mitchell Tower was and she helped me find it." Her eyes held both hurt and accusation. "You lied to us. You're not homeless. You're not Ed." The simplicity of her statement hit harder than any corporate negotiation or board confrontation ever had. Ethan was suddenly painfully aware of the gathering audience. Receptionists, security guards, employees passing through the lobby, all watching this unusual scene unfold. "Let's talk somewhere private," he said, gently guiding Lily toward the executive elevator. To Melanie, he added, "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the day. And find out what's happening with Margaret Anderson's medical appointment at—" He turned to Lily. "Which hospital, Lily?" "Harborview. The clinic part." "Harborview Clinic," Ethan repeated to Melanie. "See if she needs transportation back to Harbor Light." In his office, with the door closed against curious eyes, Ethan offered Lily a seat on one of the sleek leather sofas. She perched on the edge, her backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. Her gaze moving from the floor-to-ceiling windows to the modern art on the walls, taking in the obvious wealth surrounding her. "You're rich," she said, not a question but a conclusion. "Really rich?" Ethan nodded, sitting across from her rather than behind his imposing desk. "Yes, I own this company. This building. So why were you pretending to be homeless? Was it a trick? Were you laughing at us?" The accusation stung all the more because of its partial truth. Hadn't his experiment begun as a kind of tourism in others' misery, a way to ease his own existential discomfort, rather than a genuine attempt to help? "No, Lily, I wasn't laughing at anyone." He searched for words a child might understand. "I wanted to understand what it was really like in the shelters, so I could help better. Like when we do experiments in science class," she asked, her natural curiosity temporarily overriding her sense of betrayal. "Something like that. But I made a mistake. I didn't think about how it would affect the people I met. People like you and your grandmother." Lily considered this, her young face serious. "Grandma's going to be really mad. She doesn't like being fooled." Despite everything, Ethan smiled. "I don't blame her. I owe you both an apology. Are you going to come back to Harbor Light now that I know who you are?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't thought that far ahead, had been so caught up in maintaining his double life that he hadn't planned for its inevitable collapse. "I don't know," he admitted. "Would you want me to?" Lily shrugged, but her expression suggested she'd given it thought. "You were nice. You gave me my birthday presents. And you listened when I talked about space." She paused, then added with the brutal honesty of childhood, "But I don't like that you lied." "That's fair." Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Lily, how did you figure it out?" "That I was not who I said I was. Lots of things. You talk different than the other shelter people. Your hands don't look right. They're too clean underneath the dirt. And you ask questions about stuff that homeless people already know." She tilted her head. "Plus, I saw your watch once when your sleeve went up. Grandma used to work in a jewelry store before the library. She taught me about watches. Yours costs more than a car." Ethan glanced at his wrist where his Patek Philippe gleamed subtly. He'd been careful to remove it during his time as Ed, but apparently not careful enough. Outsmarted by an 8-year-old's observational skills. "You're very perceptive," he said with genuine admiration. "That means I notice things," Lily replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "My teacher says that too." A knock at the door interrupted them. Melanie entered with a tray of hot chocolate and cookies. "I thought your guest might be hungry," she said, giving Lily a warm smile before turning to Ethan. "And I've reached Miss Anderson at Harborview. She's quite concerned about her granddaughter's whereabouts." The understatement was clear in Melanie's tone. "Did you explain the situation?" Ethan asked. "As well as I could, sir, though I'm not entirely clear on it myself. I've arranged for a car to bring her here once her appointment concludes. That should be in about 30 minutes. After Melanie left, Lily cautiously accepted the hot chocolate, her eyes widening at the first sip. "This is the good kind. With real chocolate. Only the best in the Mitchell Tower," Ethan said, trying for levity, though his mind was racing ahead to the inevitable confrontation with Margaret. "Is this where you were going when you said you were looking for work?" Lily asked between sips. "Yes, I was trying to be both people. Ed at the shelter and Ethan, my real self, here. That sounds hard. It is. Ethan watched her enjoy the cookies, reminded again of how simple pleasures, hot chocolate made with real chocolate. Fresh-baked cookies were luxuries to this child. "Lily, can I ask you something? That first night when you shared your dinner with me, why did you do that?" Lily looked confused by the question, as if the answer were obvious. "Because you only had green beans. That's not enough for dinner, especially for a grown-up. But you didn't have much yourself." She shrugged again. "Grandma always says we have to help each other. Otherwise, what's the point?" "What's the point?" Ethan repeated softly. The simple wisdom in her words struck deeper than any philosophical treatise or motivational business book ever had. They passed the next half hour with Lily exploring Ethan's office, asking questions about everything from the voice-activated lighting system to the helicopter pad, visible on a neighboring building. Her wonder at these everyday features of his wealthy existence made him see them anew, not as entitlements but as extraordinary privileges. When Melanie announced Margaret's arrival, Ethan steeled himself. The older woman entered leaning heavily on her cane, her face a mask of worry that transformed to shock when she saw her granddaughter comfortably ensconced in what was clearly an executive office. "Lily Grace Anderson, do you have any idea how worried I've been?" Despite her frail appearance, Margaret's voice carried the authority of a lifetime of parenting. "You cannot just disappear from school. Anything could have happened to you." "I'm sorry, Grandma," Lily said, contrite but not cowed. "But look, Ed is really Mr. Mitchell. He owns the building. And he has hot chocolate with real chocolate." Margaret's gaze shifted to Ethan, confusion giving way to dawning comprehension, then to something harder to define, a mixture of disbelief and indignation. "You," she said, her voice low, "you've been pretending to be homeless, staying at Harbor Light under false pretenses." Ethan rose to his feet. "Mrs. Anderson, I can explain. Can you?" Her grip tightened on her cane. "Can you explain why a wealthy man would masquerade as one of us? Was it entertaining? A social experiment, perhaps? Or just a way to ease your conscience about having so much while others have so little?" Each question landed like a physical blow because they echoed his own doubts about his initial motivations. "Say it wasn't like that." "Not entirely. Yes, it began as an attempt to understand. But it became something more." "Something more," Margaret repeated, skepticism evident in every syllable. "Well, Mr. Mitchell, or Ed, or whoever you are, your little adventure had real consequences. My granddaughter put herself in danger today because of your deception." "Grandma, I was careful," Lily interjected. "I took the bus like we always do, and I asked for directions." "Not now, Lily," Margaret said, though her tone had softened. To Ethan, she continued, "Do you have any idea what it's like to discover your child is missing? To get a call saying she never arrived at school? Then to hear she's somehow at the Mitchell Tower with a billionaire who's been pretending to be homeless?" Her voice broke slightly. "The fear. You can't imagine." Shame washed over Ethan. In his elaborate charade, he hadn't considered the potential real-world implications. "You're right. I'm deeply sorry, Mrs. Anderson. My intentions may have started nobly, but I didn't think through the consequences." Melanie appeared at the door again. "Sir, the media is calling. Someone tipped them off about the situation. They're asking for a statement." The perfect storm was building. His executives bewildered by his behavior, his deception exposed, and now the media circling. Ethan made a split-second decision. "Melanie, call Daniel Cooper to my office immediately and contact our PR team. Tell them to prepare for a major announcement." He turned back to Margaret and Lily. "Mrs. Anderson, I know you have every right to be angry with me, but I'd like to make things right if you'll allow me. Not just for you and Lily, but for everyone at Harbor Light." Margaret's expression remained guarded. And how exactly do you propose to do that, Mr. Mitchell? Write a check? Host a charity gala? Name a wing after yourself? The bitterness in her voice was justified, but Ethan had come too far to retreat now. No, something more meaningful than that. Something that might actually make a difference. He met her gaze directly. But I'll need your help to do it right. Before Margaret could respond, Daniel burst into the office, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. He stopped short at the sight of Margaret and Lily. Ethan, what the hell is going on? The board is in an uproar. There are reporters in the lobby and... He gestured helplessly at the unexpected visitors. Danny, I'd like you to meet Lily Anderson and her grandmother, Margaret. They're friends of mine from Harbour Light Shelter. Ethan's voice was calm, his decision made. And they're about to help us change how EnvisionTech approaches corporate social responsibility. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Ethan sequestered himself with Daniel, Margaret, Lily, and a hastily assembled team of PR specialists and corporate lawyers. As the story of the billionaire CEO who went undercover as a homeless man began to leak to the press, EnvisionTech's damage control machine kicked into high gear. This could go one of two ways, said Vivian Reeves, head of public relations, her expression grave. Either you're the heartless rich guy who treated homelessness like a tourist attraction, or you're the visionary leader who immersed himself in the problem to find real solutions. I started as the first and hoped to become the second, Ethan admitted. The truth is somewhere in between. Daniel paced the conference room, occasionally glancing at Margaret and Lily, who sat quietly observing the corporate machine in motion. The board is concerned about optics, potential liability issues with the shelter, accusations of fraud. He ran a hand through his hair. This is a PR nightmare, Ethan. Or an opportunity, Ethan countered, his mind already racing ahead. What if we get in front of this? Not just with a statement, but with action? Real substantial change? Margaret, who had been silent since their initial confrontation, finally spoke. Mr. Mitchell, while your executives worry about stock prices and public image, there are people back at Harbour Light wondering where their next meal will come from. Whatever grand gesture you're planning, I hope it acknowledges that reality. The room fell silent, corporate concerns suddenly seeming trivial in the face of her quiet dignity. Lily, sensing the tension, reached for her grandmother's hand. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Anderson, Ethan said, and that's exactly why I need your help. Not as props in a PR stunt, but as advisors on what would actually make a difference. Margaret's skepticism was evident, but she nodded slightly, willing at least to listen. By evening, a plan had taken shape. Ethan would hold a press conference the following morning to address the situation directly. But more importantly, he would announce a major new initiative, the Harbour Light Foundation, funded with an initial $50 million of his personal fortune and backed by EnvisionTech's resources and technological expertise. The foundation will focus on 3 areas, Ethan explained to the assembled team. Transitional housing with wraparound services, educational and vocational training, and healthcare access for the homeless. We'll pilot the program with Harbour Light Shelter, then expand to other facilities across Seattle and eventually nationwide. And the governance structure? Daniel asked, still concerned about potential fallout. A board consisting of shelter administrators, former residents who have successfully transitioned to stable housing, social workers, and yes, some EnvisionTech executives. Ethan glanced at Margaret. And I'd like Mrs. Anderson to serve as a special advisor if she's willing. Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise. Me? I'm hardly an expert on running foundations. But you are an expert on the reality of homelessness, not from studying it, but from living it. That perspective is invaluable, and too often missing from these kinds of initiatives. As the meeting concluded and the various team members dispersed to prepare for the next day's announcement, Ethan arranged for a car to take Margaret and Lily back to Harbour Light. He'd offered them a hotel for the night, but Margaret had declined, insisting they return to the shelter. The other residents would wonder what happened to us, she explained, and unlike some, we don't have the luxury of simply disappearing from our lives. The subtle rebuke wasn't lost on Ethan. I understand, but I hope you'll consider my offer about the foundation. Your input would ensure we're addressing real needs, not just what we think people need. Margaret studied him for a long moment. I'll think about it. But first, I want to see if your actions match your words tomorrow." After they left, Daniel stayed behind, his expression troubled. "Ethan, are you sure about this? 50 million is a significant personal commitment, and the company resources you're talking about allocating, the board might push back." "Let them," Ethan replied, a new certainty in his voice. "I've spent years chasing growth for growth's sake, treating philanthropy as a box to check, rather than a genuine commitment. It's time for a change." "This is about more than charity, isn't it?" Daniel asked quietly. "Something happened to you in that shelter." Ethan thought of Lily sharing her meager dinner, of Margaret's fierce protection of her dignity, despite their circumstances, of the countless stories he'd heard from other residents, stories of resilience, of bad luck, of systems failing people who needed them most. "I saw humanity in its rawest form. Danny, not filtered through board meetings or fundraising galas or quarterly reports, just people helping each other survive, sharing what little they had." He shook his head, still processing the experience himself. "It made me question everything about how I've been measuring success, both for the company and for myself." The next morning, the plaza in front of Mitchell Tower was packed with reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers. Rumors about the reclusive billionaire's strange behavior had spread overnight, fueled by social media speculation and insider leaks. The stage was set for either a spectacular corporate meltdown or a masterful reinvention. Ethan stood at the window of his office, watching the crowd gather. He'd chosen to wear a simple suit today, deliberately avoiding the ostentatious luxury that had once been his uniform. At precisely 10 a.m., he would step onto that stage and reveal his dual identity to the world. "Are you ready for this?" Melanie asked, entering with his talking points for the press conference. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, leaving the window to review the notes one last time. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah Reynolds from Harbour Light stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, the name clearly strange on her lips after knowing him only as Ed. "Jim sent me to see if this is real, I suppose. The rumors are all over the shelter this morning." Ethan motioned her in. "It's real, Sarah, and I hope you and Jim will be part of what happens next." He handed her a prospectus outlining the Harbour Light Foundation. "This is just the beginning, but I wanted the shelter staff to see it before the public announcement." Sarah scanned the document, her professional composure giving way to emotion as she grasped the scale of what was being proposed. This would change everything, for so many people. "That's the goal," Ethan said simply. At 10 o'clock, Ethan stepped onto the stage in the plaza, facing a forest of microphones and cameras. The buzz of conversation died as he approached the podium, an expectant hush falling over the crowd. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite the surreal nature of the moment. "I'm here today to share a story, my story, but more importantly, the story of people whose voices are rarely heard in places like this." He recounted his experience simply and honestly, acknowledging both his initial privileged perspective and the profound change that had occurred over his time at Harbour Light. He spoke of Lily's generosity, of Margaret's dignity, of Sarah and Jim's tireless work with limited resources. "I entered Harbour Light Shelter thinking I would gain insight into homelessness as a social problem," Ethan continued. "What I didn't expect was to gain insight into myself, into the emptiness at the heart of success without purpose, wealth without compassion, power without responsibility." The reporters were rapt, sensing that this was more than the typical corporate mea culpa or charitable announcement. This was a public transformation, a powerful man openly questioning the values that had defined his rise to the top. "Today, I'm announcing the creation of the Harbour Light Foundation, with an initial personal commitment of $50 million and the full technological and logistical support of Envision Tech." He outlined the foundation's three-pronged approach, emphasizing the importance of dignity, agency, and long-term solutions over quick fixes and photo opportunities. But most importantly, Ethan concluded, this foundation will be guided by the expertise of those who understand homelessness, not from statistics or studies, but from lived experience. People like Margaret Anderson, who despite facing extraordinary challenges, has raised a granddaughter with more compassion and wisdom than many of us in positions of privilege ever learn." He gestured to where Margaret and Lily sat in the front row, cameras swiveling to capture their reaction. Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral, though her eyes betrayed a mixture of skepticism and cautious hope. Lily, less guarded, beamed with the natural enthusiasm of childhood. "I've learned that true understanding requires more than observation. It requires connection, humanity, and sometimes it requires the courage to accept help from those you thought you were trying to help." Ethan paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd. "I went to Harbour Light thinking I would find answers. Instead, I found questions, better questions about who we are as a society, what we owe each other, and how success should be measured." The questions from reporters came fast and furious after his statement. Some focused on the logistics of the foundation, others on the ethical implications of his undercover stint, still others on how this would affect EnvisionTech's business strategy moving forward. Through it all, Ethan maintained the same calm certainty that had settled over him since making his decision. Yes, he understood the concerns about privacy and deception. No, he hadn't consulted the board before making his personal financial commitment. Yes, this represented a significant shift in his approach to philanthropy. Near the end of the session, a reporter from the Seattle Times asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Mr. Mitchell, critics might say this is just an elaborate PR stunt after you were caught playing homeless tourist. How do you respond to that?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "I can't control how others interpret my actions. What I can control is what I do next. The Harbour Light Foundation isn't a one-time donation or a temporary project. It's a commitment to structural change, guided by the very people it aims to serve. Judge me and this initiative not by today's announcement, but by the results we deliver in the months and years to come." As the press conference concluded and Ethan stepped away from the podium, he found Margaret waiting, Lily at her side. "Well," Margaret said, her voice low enough that only he could hear, "you certainly know how to make a splash, Mr. Mitchell." "Ethan, please," he replied, "and I meant what I said about wanting your involvement. Not as a token gesture, but because your perspective is essential to getting this right." Margaret studied him, her gaze penetrating. "You understand that real change takes more than money. It takes time, persistence, working through failures, adjusting course." "I'm learning that," Ethan admitted. "Which is why I need advisors who won't just tell me what I want to hear." A ghost of a smile touched Margaret's lips. "Well, that I can certainly provide." Lily, who had been listening to this exchange with the solemn attention she brought to all adult conversations, tugged at Ethan's sleeve. "Does this mean we don't have to live at the shelter anymore?" The question, so direct and hopeful, caught both adults off guard. Margaret began to form what was clearly going to be a cautious response, but Ethan knelt down to Lily's level. "Not right away," he said honestly. "Building new housing and programs will take time. But yes, that's exactly what it means eventually. For you and your grandmother, and for many others too." Lily nodded, processing this answer with the seriousness she applied to everything. "Good, because I don't mind the shelter, but Grandma needs her own bathroom. And I need a quiet place to study if I'm going to be an astronaut doctor." Despite everything, the media circus, the corporate uncertainty, the enormity of the task ahead, Ethan found himself smiling, truly smiling, for what felt like the first time in years. The days following Ethan's dramatic public announcement brought a whirlwind of reactions. The media initially seized on the sensational aspects. Billionaire goes undercover. Child discovers his secret identity, painting the story in broad, simplistic strokes that missed the deeper transformation at work. Social media erupted with both praise and criticism, some hailing Ethan as a new breed of socially conscious CEO, others dismissing the entire episode as a calculated publicity stunt. Within EnvisionTech, the response was equally divided. Some executives embraced the company's new direction, seeing both humanitarian and strategic advantages in a stronger focus on social impact. Others, particularly older board members more focused on traditional metrics of success, pushed back against what they saw as a reckless personal crusade. "The quarterly projections are already suffering," warned Victor Hargrove, the most vocal critic on the board, during an emergency meeting called 3 days after the press conference. Stock's down 7 points since your announcement, Ethan. Investors are nervous about this sudden pivot. They'll adjust, Ethan replied calmly, especially when they see that our commitment to social responsibility doesn't mean abandoning profitability. It means reimagining what sustainable success looks like. Daniel, sitting beside him, nodded in agreement, though Ethan knew his friend and COO was still processing the radical transformation in his leadership approach. The Harbour Light Foundation is being funded by my personal assets, Ethan reminded the board. The company's involvement is strategic, not financial, leveraging our technology and expertise to solve problems that matter. Problems that, frankly, we've been insulated from for too long. Victor wasn't satisfied. And this woman you're bringing onto the foundation board, this homeless grandmother, what qualifies her besides a sob story? The room fell uncomfortably silent at the dismissive characterization. Ethan felt a flash of the old anger that once would have dominated his response, but now he channeled it differently. Margaret Anderson raised a daughter alone after being widowed young. When that daughter fell into addiction, she stepped in to raise her granddaughter. She maintained her dignity and ethics through circumstances that would break most of us in this room. His voice remained even, but there was steel beneath the words. Her qualification is wisdom earned through adversity, something we could use more of in our decision-making. The meeting ended with no clear resolution. The tension between old and new visions for Envision Tech unresolved, but at least openly acknowledged. As executives filed out, Daniel lingered. That was different, he observed once they were alone. The old Ethan would have shut Victor down with a threat to his position or an ego-crushing takedown. The old Ethan was more concerned with winning arguments than finding solutions, Ethan replied. And speaking of solutions, how are we progressing with the foundation setup? Daniel consulted his tablet. Legal framework is in place. The initial funding transfer is complete. We're securing office space near Harbour Light. Margaret insisted it be within walking distance of the populations it serves. Smart, Ethan nodded. She's already proving her value. And the Transitional Housing Initiative? We've identified 3 potential properties. Sarah and Jim from Harbour Light are reviewing them tomorrow. I'd like to have the first location secured within 2 weeks. While the corporate machinery of Envision Tech began the slow process of realignment, Ethan found himself drawn back to Harbour Light Shelter, this time as himself, without disguise or deception. His first visit after the press conference had been awkward. The residents and staff unsure how to interact with the billionaire they'd known as Ed Jim Parker. The shelter director had broken the ice with his characteristic bluntness. Well, if it isn't our resident undercover boss, he'd said, extending a hand. Gotta say, you played a convincing homeless guy, though the hands were a dead giveaway to anyone really looking. So I've been told, Ethan replied, thinking of Lily's observant comment about his 2 clean hands. I hope you can forgive the deception, Jim. Depends what comes of it, Jim had answered. We've had rich folks make big promises before. Time will tell if yours are different. That challenge, to prove that his commitment went beyond words or even money, drove Ethan forward through the inevitable obstacles. He began spending 3 afternoons a week at the shelter, not as a resident but as a volunteer, working alongside staff to understand the day-to-day realities that no brief undercover stint could fully reveal. He learned about the bureaucratic mazes that residents navigated to access benefits, the catch-22s that made finding employment nearly impossible without an address, the healthcare challenges that went untreated until they became emergencies. Each conversation, each story added layers to his understanding and refined his vision for what the Harbour Light Foundation could accomplish. Margaret, after initial reluctance, agreed to serve as the Foundation's special advisor. Her first official act was to insist on a community advisory panel consisting entirely of current or former homeless individuals. No offense. Mr. Mitchell, Ethan, she corrected herself during their first formal meeting, but even with your week at Harbour Light, you still see homelessness through the lens of privilege. We need voices that don't have that filter. Ethan agreed immediately, impressed yet again by her clarity of vision. Lily, meanwhile, had become something of a shelter celebrity after the story broke. Her teachers and classmates suddenly viewed her differently, some with newfound respect, others with uncomfortable curiosity. The attention might have overwhelmed many children, But Lily navigated it with her characteristic straightforwardness. "People ask me what it's like to know a billionaire," she told Ethan during one of his volunteer shifts, helping her with homework in the shelter's small common area. "I tell them you're just a person who has a lot of money and a really big office." Ethan laughed. "That's a pretty accurate description. My science teacher wants to know if you'll come talk to our class about being a tech CEO," Lily continued, erasing a math problem and starting over. "I said I'd ask, but you're pretty busy changing the world." The casual confidence in her statement, that he was, in fact, changing the world, humbled him. "I'll make time," he promised. "Science classes are important, especially for future astronaut doctors." 4 weeks after the press conference, the Harbour Light Foundation achieved its first concrete milestone, the purchase of a former apartment building 3 blocks from the shelter. The property, a 3-story structure with 22 units, would be renovated to serve as transitional housing for families currently staying at Harbour Light. The day the sale closed, Ethan brought Margaret and Lily to see the building. As they stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the brick facade with its weathered fire escapes and boarded windows, Margaret shook her head in wonder. "When I was a girl, my father used to say, 'Don't count on miracles, but leave the window open for them.' I think this qualifies as a miracle with the window wide open." "It needs a lot of work," Ethan cautioned, mindful of managing expectations. "Renovations will take at least 3 months. But then families with children will have their own space," Margaret said, her voice steady. "Privacy, dignity, a kitchen to cook meals, a bathroom that isn't shared with 20 strangers." She turned to look at him directly. "Do you know what that means? Not just comfort, but humanity restored." Inside, despite the peeling paint and musty smell of long vacancy, Lily ran from room to room in the unit Ethan had designated for her and Margaret, already planning where her books would go, where she'd study, how she'd decorate if allowed. Her excitement was contagious, cutting through the anxiety about deadlines and budgets that had dominated Ethan's thoughts. "This is really happening, isn't it?" Margaret said quietly, watching her granddaughter examine the kitchen cabinets with the serious attention she brought to everything. "Not just talk, not just plans on paper." "It's really happening," Ethan confirmed. "And this is just the beginning." The renovation project became a focus of community energy. Contractors and construction teams worked alongside volunteers, some from Envision Tech's workforce, others from the neighborhood, and even some shelter residents with relevant skills. What might have been just another real estate development became something more, a physical manifestation of collective hope. Not everyone was supportive, of course. Neighborhood associations raised concerns about property values. City officials worried about zoning and precedent. Some shelter residents themselves were skeptical, having seen too many promised solutions evaporate before making any real difference in their lives. 6 weeks into the project, Ethan arrived at the construction site to find a small group of protesters on the sidewalk, carrying signs with slogans like "No homeless housing in our neighborhood" and "Mitchell's mistake." A local news crew was capturing the scene, interviewing a well-dressed woman who appeared to be the group's spokesperson. "Property owners have rights too," she was saying as Ethan approached. "We sympathize with the homeless, but this will bring drugs, crime, and disorder to a neighborhood we've worked hard to improve." The reporter, spotting Ethan, swung the camera in his direction. "Mr. Mitchell, any response to the neighborhood concerns about your transitional housing project?" Ethan could feel his old reflexes kicking in, the corporate instinct to control the narrative, to overpower opposition with force of personality and resources. Instead, he took a breath and considered how Margaret might handle this moment. "I understand the concerns," he said, surprising both the reporter and the protesters with his measured tone. "Change is always difficult, and there are legitimate questions about any new development in an established neighborhood. That's why we're hosting a community forum next week, to listen, to address concerns, and to share our vision for how this project benefits everyone, not just its future residents." The protest spokesperson looked momentarily thrown by this reasonable response, clearly having prepared for confrontation rather than conversation. "We'll see about that," she recovered, though with less certainty. "This neighborhood has been improving, and we don't want to see that progress reversed." "I agree completely," Ethan replied. "Progress is exactly what we all want. The question is whether progress can include everyone or must come at the expense of our most vulnerable neighbors. Later that day, as Ethan recounted the encounter during a foundation meeting, Margaret nodded in approval. "You're learning," she said. "Fighting fear with facts rarely works. You have to acknowledge the emotion behind the resistance." "I had a good teacher," Ethan replied. "Several, in fact." He glanced around the table at the assembled team, Jim, Sarah, Margaret, and several other Harbour Light staff and residents who had taken on roles with the foundation. People whose expertise came not from business schools, but from life experience, whose wisdom had been earned rather than taught. That evening, Ethan stopped by Harbour Light for his regular volunteer shift. The shelter was still operating at full capacity, the transitional housing project still months from completion. The daily work of providing meals, beds, and basic services continued regardless of press conferences or foundation initiatives. As he helped serve dinner, Ethan found himself next to Pete, the grizzled shelter regular who had first shown him the ropes during his undercover stay. "Never thought I'd be dishing up stew alongside a billionaire," Pete commented, ladling the thick soup into a resident's bowl. "Life takes some weird turns." "That it does," Ethan agreed. "Though I'm still the same guy you gave shelter advice to," Pete snorted. "No, you're not. That guy was playing a part. This guy," he gestured to Ethan with his ladle, "this guy's actually doing something. Big difference." The simple observation, coming from someone who had seen through pretense out of necessity for survival, hit Ethan with unexpected force. Pete was right. He wasn't the same person who had entered Harbour Light Shelter that first night, driven by a vague desire to understand. That person had been transformed, not just by what he'd seen, but by who he'd met. Lily with her unflagging hope, Margaret with her hard-earned wisdom, and countless others whose humanity had shone through despite circumstances designed to diminish it. The question now was whether that transformation could extend beyond one man to the systems and structures that had created such inequality in the first place. The Harbour Light Foundation was a start, but Ethan was beginning to realize how much further they needed to go. 3 months after the purchase of the apartment building, the first phase of renovations was nearing completion. What had once been a neglected property with boarded windows and crumbling infrastructure was now a vibrant space with secure entry systems, energy-efficient appliances, and thoughtfully designed common areas. The transformation of the physical space paralleled the deeper changes taking place within Ethan, Envision Tech, and the broader community. The community forum Ethan had promised the protesters had proven to be a turning point. Instead of a corporate presentation with slick visuals and rehearsed talking points, Margaret had suggested a different approach: let the future residents speak for themselves. Lily had been the first to address the packed community center, her small frame barely visible behind the podium until someone found a box for her to stand on. "My name is Lily Anderson, and I'm 8 years old," she had begun, her voice clear and unwavering despite the roomful of adults. "I live at Harbour Light Shelter with my grandmother. Before that we had an apartment, but then Grandma got sick and couldn't work anymore." The room had fallen silent, even the most vocal opponents subdued by the child's direct simplicity. "At the shelter, we share everything. The bathroom, the dining room, even the air we breathe. There's no quiet place to do homework or read books. My grandma has trouble getting to the bathroom at night because it's down the hall and her legs don't work so well since her stroke." Lily had looked around the room, making eye contact with the neighbors who had protested the project. "We're not scary. We're just people who need a place to live. I want to be an astronaut doctor someday, and I need a quiet place to study. My grandma used to be a librarian before she got sick. She's really smart and knows all about books." Other residents had followed: a single father who had lost his job and apartment after an injury, a woman who had fled domestic violence with her teenage son, an elderly man who had worked his whole life, only to find his pension insufficient for Seattle's soaring rents. Each story chipped away at the abstract fear of the homeless and replaced it with the concrete reality of individual human beings facing challenges that could befall anyone. By the end of the evening, the tone had shifted dramatically. Not everyone was convinced, but the conversation had evolved from opposition to cautious engagement. Several neighbors had even volunteered to help with the renovation work, and a local gardening club offered to landscape the property's small courtyard. That's how change happens, Margaret had told Ethan afterward. Not through grand gestures or forceful arguments, but through human connection. People fear what they don't understand, and they don't understand what they haven't experienced. Now, as the move-in date approached for the first 10 families, including Margaret and Lily, the project had garnered not just acceptance, but active support from many of the same neighbors who had initially protested. The local elementary school had organized a welcome basket drive, filling laundry baskets with household essentials for each family. A nearby church had donated furniture. Even the woman who had been the protest spokesperson was now chairing a neighborhood integration committee to help the new residents connect with community resources. At Envision Tech, a similar transformation was underway. The initial stock dip following Ethan's announcement had rebounded, as the market recognized that his new approach wasn't abandoning profit for charity but integrating social impact into the company's core business model. The Harbor Light Foundation had become a testing ground for technologies that could address societal challenges, from an app that streamlined access to social services to a job-matching platform specifically designed for people with employment gaps and limited digital access. These innovations weren't just philanthropic efforts. They were opening new markets and attracting both talent and partnerships that recognized the business value of social problem-solving. Even Victor Hargrove, the most skeptical board member, had grudgingly acknowledged the strategic benefits after several major clients specifically cited Envision Tech's social commitment as a factor in their contracting decisions. On a personal level, Ethan found himself changed in ways both subtle and profound. The driven, isolated CEO who measured success in stock prices and acquisition deals had given way to a leader who valued connection, who listened more than he spoke, who recognized that true innovation came from diverse perspectives rather than corner office proclamations. His friendship with Margaret had deepened beyond their foundation work. They often shared coffee in the shelter's kitchen during quiet moments, discussing everything from childhood memories to philosophical questions about justice and community. Despite their vastly different life experiences, or perhaps because of them, each found in the other a perspective that challenged and expanded their own. "You know what I've been thinking about lately?" Margaret said during one such conversation, about a week before the scheduled move-in date. "How thin the line is between your life and mine." Ethan looked up from his coffee, intrigued. "How do you mean?" "When I was young, I had opportunities too. Scholarships, mentors who believed in me. I made different choices, marriage, family, a career that served others rather than building wealth." She adjusted her position, the lingering effects of her stroke requiring frequent movement to prevent discomfort. One medical crisis, one economic downturn, and here I am at Harbor Light. One different turn for you, a failed startup instead of a successful one, perhaps. And who knows? "I've thought about that a lot," Ethan admitted. "The role of luck in success. The myth of the self-made man." Margaret smiled slightly. "You were self-made until you were unmade by a little girl sharing her macaroni and cheese." "Best unmaking that could have happened to me," Ethan replied, returning her smile. The conversation was interrupted by Lily bursting into the kitchen, her face alight with excitement. "Mr. Mitchell, the moving truck is at the building. They're delivering the furniture." The next week passed in a flurry of final preparations. Ethan split his time between Envision Tech, where a major product launch demanded his attention, and the transitional housing project, now officially named Harbor Heights. The dual focus that had once seemed impossible to maintain now felt natural, each world informing and enriching the other. On move-in day, Ethan arrived early, helping the foundation staff with last-minute details. Each apartment had been furnished according to the family's specific needs, stocked with groceries, and personalized with welcome notes from community members. For Margaret and Lily's unit, he had added his own special touches, a reading nook filled with books for Lily, including an advanced astronomy text she had mentioned wanting to read, and an adjustable bed for Margaret that would ease her physical discomfort. As the families began to arrive, the atmosphere was one of cautious joy. Many had lived at Harbor Light for months or even years. The transition to independent housing, while desperately wanted, also brought anxiety about new responsibilities and expectations. Lily had no such reservations. She practically danced through the apartment, claiming her bedroom with its space-themed decor, exploring the kitchen, where she and her grandmother could cook their own meals, marveling at the bathroom they wouldn't have to share with anyone else. "Grandma, there's a bathtub with bubbles," her delighted voice carried from the bathroom, where she had discovered the basket of bath products left by the neighborhood welcome committee. Margaret moved more slowly through the space, touching surfaces, opening cabinets, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude and disbelief. When she reached the living room with its view of the courtyard garden, she stopped, overcome. "I never thought," she began, then had to pause to compose herself. "I never thought we'd have a home again." "It's just the beginning," Ethan said quietly. "Harbor Heights is transitional housing, a step on the path to permanent homes for everyone here." Margaret turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You've done so much already." "We've done it together," Ethan corrected, "and we're just getting started." The Foundation's next phase includes a job training center, partnerships with employers willing to hire residents, and a healthcare clinic right in this building. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Sarah from Harbor Light stood in the doorway, a tablet in hand. "Sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation with the Johnson family's apartment. The adaptive equipment for their son hasn't arrived yet, and they're here now." Ethan excused himself to help address the issue, leaving Margaret and Lily to continue settling into their new home. The rest of the day was a blur of problem-solving, celebrating small victories, and witnessing moments of profound emotion as families crossed the threshold from homelessness to housed. By evening, all 10 families had moved in, and the building hummed with the sounds of life, children exploring new spaces, parents arranging belongings, neighbors introducing themselves in hallways and common areas. A community dinner had been organized in the courtyard, with food provided by local restaurants and served by volunteers from EnvisionTech and the neighborhood. As twilight fell, Ethan found himself standing slightly apart from the gathering, watching the scene with a fullness in his heart he hadn't known was possible. Daniel appeared at his side, having come directly from the office to see the culmination of months of work. "Look at what you've created," Daniel said, gesturing to the courtyard filled with new beginnings. "Look at what Lily created," Ethan corrected. "None of this would have happened without her macaroni and cheese." Daniel laughed, though his expression remained thoughtful. "You know, when you first disappeared on your personal retreat, I thought you were having some kind of breakdown. Now I think maybe you were having a breakthrough instead." "Same thing sometimes," Ethan replied. "The old version of me did have to break down to make room for something better." Across the courtyard, Lily had gathered a group of children and was pointing up at the darkening sky, undoubtedly sharing some of her extensive knowledge about the stars that would soon be visible. Her enthusiasm was infectious, the other children craning their necks to follow her pointing finger, asking questions that she answered with authoritative certainty. Margaret sat nearby, engaged in conversation with several other parents and grandparents, her posture more relaxed than Ethan had ever seen it. The constant vigilance required by shelter living had begun to ease, allowing glimpses of the woman she had been before circumstances had narrowed her world to mere survival. "You're different," Daniel observed, following Ethan's gaze. "Happier, I think. Despite working twice as hard and taking on problems, most people in your position would consider someone else's responsibility." "That's the secret they don't tell you in business school," Ethan replied. "Purpose is more sustaining than profit. Connection more fulfilling than competition." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the new community taking shape before their eyes, not perfect, not without challenges ahead, but fundamentally hopeful in a way that felt both radical and essential. Later, as the gathering began to disperse, families returning to their new homes to continue the process of settling in, Ethan found himself helping Lily and Margaret with the final touches to their apartment. Lily was arranging her books on the shelf in her bedroom, meticulously organizing them by subject, then alphabetically within each category. "Mr. Mitchell," she said without looking up from her task, "are you still going to visit us now that we don't live at the shelter?" The question carried echoes of abandonment fears that Ethan had come to recognize in many of the shelter's children. the worry that connections, like so much else in their lives, would prove temporary. "Of course I am," he assured her. "We're friends now, aren't we? And I'm counting on you to keep teaching me about space." Lily nodded, satisfied. "Good, because I have a new book about black holes, and it has some really complicated parts I want to discuss." In the living room, Margaret was arranging a small collection of family photos, one of the few possessions she'd managed to hold onto through their journey to homelessness. Among them was a picture of Lily as a toddler, held in the arms of a young woman with the same honey-blonde hair, her mother, Ethan presumed. "She would be proud of her daughter," Ethan said quietly, nodding toward the photo. Margaret's hand lingered on the frame. She had such potential, such brightness. "The drugs took all that away bit by bit," she sighed, the old grief evident in her voice. "But yes, she would be proud of Lily, as am I, every single day." 1 year to the day after Ethan Mitchell had first stepped through the doors of Harbor Light Shelter, he stood at the podium in the courtyard of Harbor Heights, addressing a gathered crowd of residents, community members, media, and corporate partners. The anniversary had become an occasion not just to reflect on the journey, but to announce the next phase of the Harbor Light Foundation's work. "A year ago, I thought I was embarking on an experiment in understanding," Ethan began, the familiar faces in the audience grounding him in the reality of what had been accomplished. "What I discovered instead was a community that would teach me more about humanity, resilience, and genuine connection than all my years in boardrooms and business schools combined." The Harbor Light Foundation had expanded beyond its initial focus on the transitional housing at Harbor Heights. The on-site health clinic now provided care to both residents and the surrounding neighborhood. The job training center had placed over 50 formerly homeless individuals in stable employment. A second property had been acquired and was being renovated to serve as permanent affordable housing, with residents of Harbor Heights given priority for apartments. "But buildings and programs are just the framework," Ethan continued. "The heart of our work is the people, the individuals and families who remind us daily that homelessness is not an identity but a circumstance, not a personal failing but a systemic one." He gestured to the side of the stage, where Margaret sat among the Foundation's board of directors. In the year since moving into Harbor Heights, she had become not just an advisor, but a central figure in shaping the Foundation's approach. Her health had improved with regular medical care, and while she still walked with a cane, her energy and engagement had blossomed in the stability of a permanent home. "Today, we're announcing 2 new initiatives," Ethan said. "First, the expansion of our transitional housing model to 5 additional sites across Seattle, with groundbreaking scheduled for next month. And second, the launch of the Harbor Light Advocacy Institute, which will focus on the policy changes needed to address the root causes of homelessness." Applause rippled through the audience, strongest among those who understood firsthand the significance of these developments. In the front row, Lily, now 9 and dressed in a NASA t-shirt that had been a gift from an Envision Tech engineer who'd become her mentor, clapped enthusiastically, her face glowing with pride. "To lead the Advocacy Institute, I'm honored to introduce our new executive director, someone whose lived experience, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to dignity for all makes her uniquely qualified for this role." Ethan turned toward Margaret. "Margaret Anderson, would you join me?" Margaret rose slowly but steadily, making her way to the podium with a quiet dignity that had come to define her public presence. The crowd's applause deepened, many rising to their feet in recognition of a woman whose journey from shelter resident to Foundation leader embodied the transformation they were celebrating. "Thank you," Margaret said as the applause finally subsided. "When I first met Ethan Mitchell, or Ed Marshall as he called himself then, I was suspicious of his interest in my granddaughter. After all, a child's generosity should not be exceptional enough to merit special attention." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the crowd, many familiar with the story of Lily's shared macaroni and cheese that had become something of a Foundation legend. "What I've come to understand," Margaret continued, her voice strengthening, "is that in a world that often values the wrong things, recognizing and honoring simple human kindness is indeed revolutionary. At the Harbor Light Advocacy Institute, we'll be focusing on policies that reflect this basic truth, that every person deserves dignity, opportunity, and the chance to both give and receive kindness. As Margaret outlined the Institute's initial policy priorities, eviction prevention, healthcare access, living wage initiatives, Ethan watched the audience's reactions. The community members who had once protested Harbour Heights were now among its strongest supporters, having seen firsthand how stable housing transformed not just individual lives, but the neighborhood as a whole. Envision Tech executives who had questioned his distraction now pointed to the foundation as a case study in corporate social innovation. Even Victor Hargrove had come around, albeit grudgingly, after the company's reputation for social responsibility had helped secure a major government contract. But it was the residents themselves whose responses mattered most to Ethan. People like Pete, the grizzled shelter regular who now worked as a maintenance supervisor at Harbour Heights, or the Johnson family, whose son with special needs was thriving in an accessible apartment designed for his specific requirements, or Sarah from Harbour Light, who had joined the foundation's staff and was leading the planning for the new transitional housing sites. After the formal program concluded, the anniversary celebration continued with a community meal in the courtyard. The space had flourished in the year since its creation, with resident-tended garden beds producing vegetables for shared meals and children playing on equipment donated by a local business. Ethan moved through the gathering, engaging in conversations that ranged from policy details with city officials to progress updates from residents working toward their personal goals. The ease with which he navigated these varied interactions was a testament to how far he'd come from the isolated CEO who had once viewed homelessness as an abstract problem to be solved with checkbook charity. Near the fountain that served as the courtyard's centerpiece, he found Lily deep in conversation with a group of Envision Tech engineers who had volunteered their time to create a STEM program for Harbour Heights children. She was explaining with impressive technical accuracy how the recent Mars rover landing mechanism worked, and the sky crane had to lower it just right because if it hit the surface too hard, all the instruments could break, she was saying, her hands mimicking the descent. The whole time the engineers at NASA had to just wait to know if it worked, because the signal takes minutes to reach Earth from Mars. The engineers were nodding, genuinely engaged, rather than merely humoring her. One of them, Jessica Chen from the robotics division, added, "The time delay is one of the biggest challenges in space exploration. That's why autonomous systems are so critical for missions beyond Earth orbit." Lily's eyes lit up at this new information. So the rover has to think for itself? In a way, yes, Jessica confirmed. It has programming that allows it to make certain decisions without waiting for instructions from Earth. Like artificial intelligence? Lily pressed, clearly connecting this to knowledge she'd acquired elsewhere. A specialized form of it, yes. Ethan watched the exchange with quiet pride. A year ago, Lily's intelligence and curiosity had been constrained by circumstances. Limited access to books, no internet at the shelter, the constant stress of instability. Now with resources and mentorship, she was flourishing, her natural gifts finding the nourishment they deserved. "I see our resident astronaut is holding court," Margaret said, joining Ethan as he observed from a slight distance. "She's remarkable," Ethan replied. "Jessica tells me she's already working at a middle school level in math and science." Margaret nodded, unsurprised. She always had the ability. Now she has the opportunity to match it. She glanced at Ethan. "That's what all this has really been about, hasn't it? Not charity, but justice, allowing people to reach their potential." "You taught me that," Ethan acknowledged, along with many other things. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the community they'd helped build flourish around them. Then Margaret said, "I've been meaning to ask you something. That first night at Harbour Light, when Lily shared her food with you, what were you thinking? What did you feel in that moment?" Ethan considered the question carefully, transported back to that pivotal interaction. Shock, initially, that someone with so little would share with a stranger. Then something deeper, a recognition that I'd been measuring wealth and success all wrong. That this child with nothing by society's standards possessed a richness of spirit I'd never achieved despite all my material success. Margaret smiled. "She has that effect on people. Always has? It changed everything for me," Ethan continued. "Made me question not just what I was doing with my resources, but who I was becoming as a person, whether the path I'd been on was leading somewhere I actually wanted to go. And now, a year later, are you on a better path? The question wasn't just polite conversation. It carried the weight of genuine concern from someone who had become both mentor and friend. A truer one, certainly, Ethan replied. Not always easier, in fact often more challenging, but more meaningful. More connected to what actually matters. Their conversation was interrupted by Lily bounding over, her energy seemingly inexhaustible. "Grandma, Mr. Mitchell, Jessica says there's going to be a mission to Jupiter's moons to look for life under the ice on Europa. And she says I can join the EnvisionTech team that's working on some of the imaging technology if I keep up with my math." "That sounds wonderful, dear," Margaret said. "But remember, you're 9. The mission probably won't launch until you're in college." "That's okay," Lily replied seriously. "I need time to prepare anyway. I've decided I definitely want to be an astrobiologist now. The astronaut doctor thing was good, but finding alien life would be way cooler." Ethan couldn't help but laugh at her matter-of-fact adjustment of life goals. "I have no doubt you'll do exactly that, Lily. And when you do, I'll remind everyone that I knew you when your ambitions were merely to be an astronaut doctor." As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Ethan found himself drawn to a quiet corner of the courtyard. From there, he could see the full scope of what had been created, not just the physical space with its gardens and playground, but the web of human connections that now flourished within and beyond it. Daniel joined him, as he often did in moments of reflection. "Penny, for your thoughts? Though given inflation and your net worth, maybe it should be $100 for your thoughts." Ethan smiled at the familiar banter. Their friendship had evolved over the past year, deepening as Daniel had moved from skepticism to support of Ethan's new direction. "I was just thinking about that homeless man, the one in the doorway who refused my money that night, the one who started all this. Have you ever tried to find him?" Ethan shook his head. "Many times. We've had outreach teams check every location where he might be. He seems to have vanished." He paused, considering. "Sometimes I wonder if he was real at all. If he was some kind of, I don't know, catalyst the universe sent to shake me out of my comfortable blindness." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That's surprisingly metaphysical for a tech CEO. A lot has changed in a year," Ethan replied with a shrug, "including my tolerance for mysteries that can't be solved with algorithms or acquisitions." As darkness fell and lights came on in the apartments surrounding the courtyard, residents and guests began to disperse. Ethan helped with the cleanup, working alongside community volunteers to restore the space for everyday use. This too marked a change, the billionaire CEO now comfortable with practical tasks, with getting his hands dirty in the literal as well as figurative sense. When the work was done, Ethan made his way to Margaret and Lily's apartment for their weekly dinner tradition. These Thursday evening meals had become a cherished constant in his transformed life, a time for conversation that ranged from foundation business to Lily's latest scientific discoveries, to Margaret's increasingly active role in city politics. Tonight, as they settled around the small dining table, there was a sense of both celebration and contemplation. The anniversary had provided a natural moment to look back, to measure the distance traveled, to acknowledge both accomplishments and the work still ahead. "I have something for both of you," Ethan said after they'd finished their meal, a hearty vegetable stew that Margaret had prepared, her mobility and strength continuing to improve with regular physical therapy. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew 2 small boxes. "It's not our birthdays," Lily pointed out, though her eyes sparkled with anticipation. "Consider it an anniversary gift," Ethan replied, sliding the boxes across the table. Margaret opened hers first, carefully lifting the lid to reveal a brooch in the shape of an open book, crafted in silver, with pages that seemed to flutter in invisible wind. "It's beautiful," she said, touching it gently. "Turn it over," Ethan prompted. On the back was an inscription, "To Margaret, who taught me to read between the lines of life." "With endless gratitude, Ethan." She looked up, her eyes bright with emotion. "I'll treasure this." Lily, meanwhile, had opened her box to find a pendant, not unlike the Saturn she had crafted herself, but this one professionally made in silver and glass, with rings that actually rotated around the planet. "Wow," she breathed, immediately putting it on. "It's like my old one, but fancy." Look inside the box, Ethan said. There's something else. Beneath the pendant lay a small card. Lily picked it up, reading aloud. This certifies that a star in the Andromeda Galaxy has been named Lily Anderson, future astrobiologist in the International Star Registry. She looked up, her expression shifting from confusion to wonder. You named a star after me? Technically, those registries aren't officially recognized by astronomers, Ethan admitted. But the sentiment is real. Somewhere out there, in a galaxy far beyond our own, there's a star shining with your name attached to it. A reminder that your light reaches further than you know. Lily launched herself from her chair to hug him, the unself-conscious affection of childhood not yet erased by age or experience. Thank you! I'm going to find it when I'm an astrobiologist. I'll point my telescope right at it. Later, after Lily had gone to bed, still clutching the star registry certificate, Margaret and Ethan sat in the living room with cups of tea. The conversation had turned reflective, as it often did in these quiet evening moments. A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be having regular dinners with a tech billionaire in an apartment provided by his foundation, while preparing to lead an advocacy institute, Margaret shook her head, the implausibility of it still striking. Life takes unexpected turns. The best kind, Ethan replied. The ones that lead you where you didn't know you needed to go. Margaret studied him over the rim of her teacup. And what about you? Are you where you need to be? The question echoed their earlier conversation in the courtyard, but seemed to ask for something deeper now, in the privacy of the evening. I'm closer, Ethan said after a thoughtful pause. A year ago I had success but not purpose, achievement but not connection. Now, he gestured to the comfortable room around them, to the home that represented not just shelter, but belonging. Now I'm learning what actually matters. I'm learning from you, from Lily, from everyone at Harbour Heights and Harbour Light, and that education is worth more than all the business deals I've ever closed. Margaret nodded, satisfied with his answer. You've come a long way from Ed Marshall and his dubious backstory. I like to think I've kept the best parts of Ed, Ethan replied with a smile. His willingness to listen, to learn, to see people as they are rather than as categories or problems to be solved. You have, Margaret confirmed, and added a few good parts of Ethan Mitchell too, his resources, his influence, his ability to turn vision into reality. Outside, the city continued its nighttime rhythm, lights glimmering in the distance. Inside this small apartment, in this building that represented both ending and beginning, past and future, the simple human connection that had started with a shared plate of macaroni and cheese had blossomed into something transformative, not just for those directly involved, but for an expanding circle of lives touched by their collective journey. As Ethan prepared to leave for the evening, he paused at the door. I've been thinking about the Foundation's next phase, about how to scale what we've learned here without losing the human touch that makes it work. And? Margaret prompted. And I think the answer is in the stories. Not just mine or Lily's or yours, but all of them. The unique paths that brought each person to Harbour Light, to Harbour Heights and beyond. If we can help people see homelessness as a collection of individual stories, rather than a faceless problem. Margaret smiled. Now you're thinking like an advocate. Stories change hearts. Hearts change policies. Policies change lives. You should use that in your first speech as executive director, Ethan suggested. It's perfect. I just might, Margaret replied. Good night, Ethan, and happy anniversary. Happy anniversary, he echoed, stepping out into the evening air. As he walked to his car, Ethan looked back at Harbour Heights, windows glowing with the light of homes reclaimed or newly found. A year ago, he had been a man disconnected from his own humanity, seeking answers in the wrong places. Now he was part of a community, still learning, still growing, still making mistakes, but fundamentally changed by the simple act of genuine connection. Somewhere in the building, Lily Anderson was probably looking out her window at the night sky, dreaming of distant worlds and the extraterrestrial life she might someday discover. Her grandmother was perhaps reading one of the books that had sustained her through difficulties Ethan could still only partially comprehend. And throughout the building and beyond, lives that had intersected with his were unfolding in new directions, shaped by both circumstance and choice, challenge and opportunity. The full circle of their journey together was not an ending, but a continuing spiral, moving ever outward to touch more lives, create more connections, build more bridges between worlds that had seemed impossibly distant just 1 year before. And it had all begun with the simplest of human gestures,